So, welcome to the show, Tara.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really happy to be here.
I am super excited to have you here because your career and your expertise overlaps with some areas that I'm really interested in personally. And to be able to have a conversation about fashion that pulls in sustainability, supply chain, ethics, innovation, it feels like a very important and on trend, if you like, conversation right now. So let's dive into the conversation. As I mentioned in the intro, you have a degree in fashion design. It's funny because so often on the show, I interview guests whose degree or educational background is quite different to where they ended up. But your journey has been very clear. So you always wanted to be in fashion. Is that something that sort of came from when you were a little kid?
Yes, it definitely did. I deviated for a very short time in high school, but I drew my
Okay.
first collection when I think I was 5 years old. And
What?
I still have, I wish I could show you. I'm not at home at the moment, but I still have that framed. I drew it on an old piece of fabric, and it's very funny because it still looks like a lot of the collections I designed to this day. In high school, I actually decided I wanted to go into politics for a brief time, and then when it came to choosing college, I went back to fashion design. My degree, the only thing that is a little bit different is my degree is in menswear. So I studied tailored menswear in school, which I now attribute to my love for durable clothing and sustainability um, because of the core values that are instilled in really designing timeless pieces that are, menswear. But other than that, I really stuck the path and stayed in the fashion industry, which I'm always grateful for.
And it's super competitive, is it not? I mean, we just had New York Fashion Week. I don't know if you were a part of that. I've seen a little bit here and there, but it's a super competitive industry.
It's a super competitive industry, and I don't think that it's necessarily well represented in the media. I think
It's
what
true.
what the average person sees and thinks of the fashion industry is that it's all glamour and parties and fashion shows, and really that's only maybe 10% of the job
Wow.
if you're lucky, and the rest is supply chain management and sales and production issues and product development and all the things that I love, but are really not very well represented when you're talking to the press or when you're showing the collection, or certainly not on television shows that are trying to represent the fashion industry. So
Right.
that's why I'm so actually grateful to have this conversation with you, and really grateful that there's now more and more a focus on supply chain and manufacturing and the hands that are making the clothes and not just the people that are designing them.
Yeah, it's so true. And I love the fact that while you were talking about the fashion industry, you talked about supply chain because it's such a huge part and a huge piece of fashion. And you have worked and held some amazing positions, right? Creative director, fashion director. At what point did you start to become more interested in the sustainability side of fashion? Because that's another big part of fashion, right? We talk about supply chain, but sustainability is another one. And when did that start standing out to you as an issue the industry needs to address? And why was it something that you wanted to be a part of?
Yeah, so I guess I attribute that to there were two kind of major aha moments in my career. The first, with regards to sustainability, was back in around 2004. I was working previous to starting my own brand. I was working for another company, and our supply chain was entirely in India and China. And so I would travel quite regularly to work directly with the factories to develop the new collections and source materials. And on one particular trip, I found organic cotton from one of my suppliers on a swatch card. And so went back to the hotel room that night and started researching the differences between organic cotton and what is now known as conventional cotton. And can I say a slightly bad word? It was really my oh shit moment. that's how
Okay,
I
yeah.
that's how I that's how
Yeah.
I frame it is, and I think it was really important to have it because I realized either I leave the industry altogether and stop polluting unknowingly as I had been doing, or I try to make change. And so that was the first pivot towards sustainability. And so with that brand, I started converting all of the materials over to more environmentally friendly materials, or at least ones that we thought were more environmentally friendly. So now the education and the information has become much more prevalent and much more easy to access. Back then, it was very difficult, and so I had very little knowledge, and all the education that I had to gain was through internet and speaking to people, and then ultimately education through FIT and other sources. But it took a long time. And then the second aha moment was when I started my brand, Study New York, back in 2009. I decided I wanted to manufacture it in New York City in the garment district here.
Awesome.
So, which would be the first time that I develop anything locally, because prior to that, even though I've been working in the industry, I guess 10 years, almost 10 years at that point, everything I had done had been overseas. And that was, and I had a great experience producing with very large factories and some smaller ones all over the world, primarily in Asia, India, but also in Brazil. Um, and so I really was learning a lot about global supply chain, but very little about local supply chain. And so
Right.
I decided I wanted to produce the brand locally using craftspeople in the garment district in New York City, not material manufacturers, unfortunately, because we really don't produce any textiles
Right.
in New York City proper for many reasons. But we do manufacture some amazing clothing. And so I started learning about how to manage a supply chain very different from overseas manufacturing. And so I all of a sudden had to be very integrated into the whole process. I had to source all the fabric myself, source all the trims, get the product developed, the pattern, literally schlep things from Brooklyn to the garment district on the subway. And so it
Wow.
was a huge learning process. And so those were really the two moments in my career that pushed me towards sustainability, and then ultimately pushed me towards a more ethical supply chain, and having a more direct face to face with the people who were making the clothes that I was selling,
Yeah.
because that wasn't always the case prior. I'd have direct contact with maybe the merchandisers and the owners of the factories, and we'd walk through the factories, but we wouldn't have these day-to-day conversations with the sewers or the pattern makers. And so this was
Right.
this was quite different.
Right. And it makes it so holistic, right? Because you get to have a touch point at every point of your supply chain. And you kind of did what a lot of companies are looking to do right now because the cost of ocean freight has like gone up a lot. Raw materials are not being produced fast enough or moved fast enough. And they're looking at local supply chains
Yeah.
versus global supply chains. And so you did that before everybody else. But I think what I love the most about what you were just talking about is that you put your money where your mouth is, right? You took action. A lot of times when we talk about sustainability or sustainable supply chains, it's all talk and no action. And so I love the fact that you did that. You mentioned that, you established your own sustainable women's wear brand called Study New York. But then after you did that, you established Resourced as well, so that you can consult with and educate others and drive change, right?
Yeah.
Not just through your own brand, but also through other brands as well. And I think those experiences also led you to your role at AT, which is an amazing, amazing commitment. So talk us through that journey. What does that look
Yeah.
like? And tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'll fill in a little bit of a blank there too. So with study, I decided. So one of the pieces of advice that I give to students now and then to clients when I'm consulting with them is that you can't. Sustainability isn't a series of checkboxes. So you can't do everything. You're going to learn
Yes.
about everything. You're going to see a lot of different solutions and options, and they're going to be very shiny and desirable. But no brand can do all of them, and in some cases they conflict with one another. And I'm not going to go too deeply into that. But when I started study, I decided, and I didn't have this full holistic understanding. It took me a long time to come to this. But when I started study, I decided the brand would be built on three core tenets, and that was responsibly sourced materials, so either dead stock textiles, leftover recycled materials, or certified organic. Zero waste patterns, so I wanted no waste in my supply chain. Not for
Awesome.
everything, but the brand itself was had a zero waste approach to
Yeah.
design. And so some of the patterns were zero waste, and others we would collect the waste and reuse it. And then local transparent manufacturing. So I was able to implement those three tenants throughout the entirety of the brand. Ultimately, that also overlapped with my work at the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, which was an initiative by Pratt Institute, where I was the sustainability mentor, and we ran a small production facility. And so that really gave me hands-on understanding of what it is to manufacture more ethically and work directly with designers. And so it was sort of a natural progression to start consulting with these smaller designers who now had a good understanding of what they were missing in their
Right.
level of understanding and what the best approach was. And so we created strategy together, and we roadmap their sustainability strategy and help them understand, but also through the lens of sourcing and responsible manufacturing.
Yeah.
So I've
So
been doing,
exciting.
yes, it really is. And I should clarify, because the landscape of sustainability is so vast and broad,
Yeah.
but I chose to only really um, approach three specific strategies myself with my own brand. It meant that there was this whole vast world of other strategies that I wasn't touching on, but I was very interested in. And so, being a mentor at the accelerator and then ultimately becoming a consultant allowed me to explore those other strategies without doing them myself in my brand.
Right.
And so that to me is the positive side of it, because it kept me engaged, it kept me learning. I was always trying to understand what the next approach or ease of use was for some of the strategies, because they were all very challenging. And now we have technology to help build in on some of them. But at the time, it was very much the wild, wild west of implementing change in the fashion industry. And so all of that really culminated in my new role as VP of Supply Chain and Sustainability at Another Tomorrow, which is as you probably know, a new-ish luxury brand that has been in the works for a few years, but officially launched right at the beginning of 2020. So you can imagine that was quite challenging. And
Wow.
yeah, yeah, wow. But with this very, very clear strategy of transparent supply chain, and not only doing no harm, but doing more good. And so the brand has accelerated quite quickly, even previous to me joining the team, um, understanding basically their sourcing all the way back to the fiber level, which means the farms where the
Right.
fiber is being
Yeah.
grown, um, for every product. And so there's a traceability journey or a provenance journey on every product that the customers can see via QR code, which is wonderful. And so this is sort of getting back to mentioning technology. Before 5 years ago, we didn't have those QR codes that were available to trace your journey
Yep.
on the website or on the product. We had to tell the story online or on a hang tag, and it's just much more clunky. And so now there is this beautiful culmination of things coming together, understanding of supply chain a little bit more, customers demanding and wanting to know where and how their clothes are made. And of course, I attribute that a lot to the fashion revolution movement that originated after Rana Plaza. And then with Another Tomorrow specifically, it's luxury clothing that is extremely well made, and made for durability and made to last a really long time, both through its styling and design, but also through its materials and manufacturing. And so the goal is to keep this product in circulation for a long time and not
Yeah.
have to, recycle it.
Well, and you bring up so many amazing points in what you just talked about. And so I'm going to touch on a couple of things. So, I recently just launched a LinkedIn learning course, which is the fundamentals of sustainable supply chain.
Right?
And one of the things that I talk about in that course is that you really need to take a look and see what developmental goals resonates with you and your brand, because like you said, you can't do everything, or you can't start off doing everything, and you've got to pick a couple of lanes to really be able to thrive and create the culture that you want around your sustainability plan. And then the other thing is we just launched a show with Topple It literally just aired a couple of weeks ago, and they're going to be doing a monthly show about sustainability and blockchain. And they're talking about how they're working with coffee farmers. And just like you're talking about fiber farmers and using the blockchain to really be able to bring everybody together. So it's an exciting new concept where there's technology, like you said, technology partners that are coming out and talking about it and talking about the technology behind it and how we can connect everybody. And so it's awesome to hear that you're already doing that and you're really, really being intentional about it. And then I think the other thing to think about too is also your packaging. So I don't know what you're doing from a packaging standpoint, but my good friend Sarah Scudder, she talks about sustainability packaging all the time. And she talks about having something on the packaging to allow people to understand how to recycle that packaging or reuse that packaging.
Yeah.
And I'm sure with you guys being so intentional about that, I'm sure you've already thought about the packaging and you're already doing that.
Packaging is actually so. There's so many things I want to I want to talk to you here, and I know this conversation can go on for a really long time. So I'll try to be concise. But packaging, I think, is generally what I see as a low hanging fruit for brands who want to start on their sustainability story, and it's obviously a much bigger issue than that. But
Right.
it is the first touch point that most
Yes.
customers have with the product, especially now with D2C brands. And Another Tomorrow is primarily a D2C brand, although we just opened our first store in the West Village in New York. So you can actually see and touch the
Congrats.
product, which is fantastic. Yeah, but
Yeah.
the packaging ultimately is really what most customers see, whether they're carrying it out of the store or they're ordering their product online. But it allows for a lot of opportunity to educate the customer, but also to use more responsible materials. However, now that circularity is becoming more and more of a conversation, and that requires reverse logistics and all kinds of
Yes.
other complexities in
Hmm.
other supply chains. Packaging is also part of that story, and so it's a packaging system that we're looking for rather than just the materials of the packaging themselves. So how can you reuse your packaging?
Yes.
How can you really make packaging more durable so that it does get
Yes.
reused? I'd look to brands like 4 Days, for example, that have this circular business model that are using packaging that is meant to be reused over and over again. So that's really inspiring, but also it's kind of the first place that I usually address with brands because it's not as personal as the product itself,
Yes.
right? So it's an
Yes.
easy conversation starter, but it's an important one. So there's
Yes.
that. The other thing that I want to touch on is technology because I think I'm personally a luddite for the most part, but I think technology is really important. I think a certain level of technology is supremely important, but what's even more important, in particular for us in Another Tomorrow, but has always been in my career, is the personal relationships that you have with your supply chain, and there's
Hmm.
really nothing that can replace that from a technology
True.
standpoint. And one of the things that I've noticed within the industry and where there's huge strides in supply chain and shifts in sustainability is with the brands who have a either embedded relationship with their supply chain, so they either own part of it or they have very close relationships, or they're able to gain that. And so one, if I can give an example of another brand that I really respect, is a footwear brand called Mazzolo, who own part of their supply chain and are very cautious about living wage all across their supply chain and educating about living wage and the people who are working. But I've noticed that most of the industry historically has always looked to their supply chain as vendors or
Right.
as key players, stakeholders perhaps, but not necessarily collaborators or partners.
Right.
And I think one of the things that I think is so beautiful about Another Tomorrow and about all these other brands that are doing great work is that they look to they realize that they wouldn't have product if it wasn't for the supply chain players, all of
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
from the farmers who raise the sheep, who have our wool, our traceable wool or our organic cotton, to the spinners and the dyers and the weavers, all of them. Like they all play a key role, and there's so much learning. There's so much historical embedded learning in all of those players, and the only way to gain that is by talking to them, having a
Hmm.
conversation, bringing them into the system so that they can help contribute to reduction in inefficiencies and waste, or new strategies that maybe the brand hasn't thought of because they're not on the ground every day in the factory, you know. And so this is some learning that I had when I was at the accelerator and we were running a factory, because we had great sample makers there and pattern makers who were doing zero waste pattern development, and then brands that would just walk in and sit with us, or come and take videos, and share that with their networks. And you know, social media is obviously
Yeah.
greatly changing this, because you can now bring a phone into a factory, as long as you know you ask permission first.
Yeah.
You can now bring a phone into a factory and share your story with your customer base, but then bring it even one step further and have that conversation with the factory, so everybody is making these decisions together, rather than it being this very linear source of information that goes from one person, usually the designer, to the technical designer, to production manager, then back to the factory, without this sort of feedback loop, you know. And that's what's
Right.
really important in moving the needle on sustainability in the industry.
Absolutely. And I don't know, this conversation just gets me so excited because I also feel like your title is VP of Supply Chain, but you're really into sustainability and making sure that the supply chain is sustainable. And there's so much that we can learn from you, but I just love the fact that we're talking about this and your title is VP of Supply Chain. And I know, I talked about this with Lisa Morales Hellibo on our last episode of Women in Supply Chain, because you mentioned circular economy and supply chains and circular economy
Yeah.
and buying secondhand, creating smaller batch of clothing lines. That's something that I touched on with Lisa. But I also feel like the industry has created consumers who are addicted to fast fashion.
Yeah.
So, how do we change the mindset around that? Or can we change the mindset? Is the mindset changing? What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is such a tough question for me, and this is what keeps me up at night, if I'm being
Yeah.
totally honest, because
Mhm.
um, I just don't know. Fast fashion isn't brand new. I grew up with a version of fast fashion in Montreal, in Canada. We had, made locally, but still very cheap, responsive to trends. And then it just ballooned out in the 90s and 2000s, and became the mega industry that it is now. And I see it on social media and I see people's responses. But I also see the flip side of people who are trying to get school clothes for an entire family of four. And how do you do that on a limited budget? And it's very, very, I think, difficult to ask an entire community, or entire world of people, to buy responsibly made clothes when maybe they themselves are not earning a living wage,
Right.
and so it's a much bigger picture. Ultimately, I think that government has to step in. I think there needs to be policy. I'm starting to see some extended producer responsibility laws in Europe. Of course, America is a little bit behind Europe when it comes to policy shift, but it is happening, and there is conversations around it, and there's great people doing great work. One example is the recent SB 62 bill in California that is on the governor's desk, or was just put on the governor's desk for approval, and that really addresses fair wages in manufacturing in California. And so that's really exciting, because we're starting to see some shift
Yes.
there, and at least conversation of it. And to me, that also represents the fact that government and industry are starting to take the fashion industry more seriously. I think it's flown
Mhm.
under the radar for a really long time, because people think it's frivolous, people think it's meaningless, but it's not. It's a huge industry. It employs, I think, upward of 80 million people around the world. Most of them are
Wow.
women, most of them are underpaid. And
Mhm.
so it's really important to shine a spotlight on the inconsistencies and the inadequacies that are happening around the world in our supply chain that makes clothing, but also to do that in a fair way, so that we can all move forward together as an industry, rather than leaving people behind. By people, I
Absolutely.
mean customers who want clothes. Like it's still a fun industry, right? I joined
Yeah.
fashion because I love clothes. I love making clothes. I love the idea of having something new, but it doesn't mean that you always need to make something new with brand new raw
Right.
materials there are alternatives, and they can be equally, if not more, exciting and innovative and inspiring. So we just have to rethink the way we do business.
I love that. And you've got your hand in so many different things. So I'm trying to think about it from my audience perspective. How do you manage it all? What does a day in your life look like?
It's funny. I try not to think about it too much. I am a slave to my Google Calendar, and
Me
it is
too.
very specifically color coded, because if it wasn't for that, I would probably have no idea what I was doing at any given moment. I try to block off tasks and jobs and roles that are like-minded. So if I'm I group calls together with factories and have similar conversations with different factories. At another tomorrow, majority of our supply chain is in Italy, so that's also a very specific time of day because of
Yeah.
time zones. But the world is out now. I'm not going to say thanks to COVID, because nothing is thanks to COVID, but the
Hmm.
world is now more connected and a little bit
Right.
more comfortable with the idea of speaking via Zoom or other online
It's true.
platforms, and so we can quickly, back to back, have many calls. Whereas a few years ago, I would have had to get on a plane and go and have, which I hope to do one day, but perhaps not as much as used to be necessary. But to be honest with you, I see a lot of overlap with all of the work that I do. It's not like I'm doing very disparate, separate,
It's true.
isolated jobs. There's
Yeah,
one
yeah.
feeds into the other. So I'm also working with a membership organization called 11 Radius that is focused specifically on education and ideating around circularity in the fashion industry, circular
Awesome.
solutions and working groups and pilot projects. And that definitely feeds into the consulting work that I do and the work at Another Tomorrow, as does the research in new materials, and material development. So, and I love learning about it all. So it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like work to me. It never really
Right.
has. But in the effort to find some work life balance, it is important that they block off that calendar at some point during the day.
I am so glad you shared that with me because I get the question all the time is how do you manage it all and what does that look like and what does your day look like? So I'm glad that I was able to ask you that as well. And I think, you've what as a woman,
Yeah.
right? What have your experiences been as you've moved through the world of fashion and then into supply chain and sustainability? I mean, fashion is very female dominated, I would say.
Yep.
Supply chain is not. Sustainability is. So,
Yeah.
have you faced any challenges along the way being a woman in any of those respective industries?
Um, so it's really interesting that you have that reflection, because that's how I've always seen things as well. So a majority of the factory owners that I've worked with have always been
Mhm.
men. Although the factory that I was working with for my brand in New York were always women owned. But there is definitely a large percentage of women who have been leading the charge of sustainability in the fashion space over the last 10 to 15 years. Um, and I would push back and say it hasn't been difficult. I mean, there's obviously issues around being a woman in the fashion industry that are inherent no matter what. But I would say that instead it's been very inclusive and accepting. I have
Awesome.
a very strong group of inspiring women, first in New York, that I have been able to lean on over my career and ask questions of and provide feedback, and will share resources, and so the networking there is just very inclusive and open source, which is definitely not inherent in the fashion industry. When
Right.
I was learning and when I first started in fashion, the number one rule was always don't share your supply chain partners, don't share your sourcing partners,
Wow.
don't tell other brands where we're producing. It's always very secretive and hidden.
Mhm.
Um, and now it's the opposite. Now you see brands sharing their supply chain on their website because they want other companies to do it.
I
So,
I
yeah.
I'm pointing to that because I always say collaboration is the
Yes,
future of
yes, yes,
business,
exactly.
and
Sorry, I
I
didn't
am
realize what you were
so
pointing to.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
so happy to hear that that is actually happening,
Yes.
and, especially in an industry, like I said at the beginning, that's so competitive, and it's just honestly awesome to see that. Was there one point in your journey through all of this that you can remember where you found your voice? Because that's another question that I get all the time from a lot of women, especially in supply chain, is how did you find your voice?
Oh, I'm going to be totally honest with you here. This one's a struggle for me. I think I'm still finding it. I think that's
Okay.
an ongoing struggle. I'm sure some
Journey.
people would, yeah, journey. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
I think some people would probably argue with me and say, I've been very vocal about and opinionated about things for the past decade, but I don't know necessarily that I felt. And when I say, when I think about finding my voice, I think about finding an empowered voice that people are
Yeah.
listening to. And I do think I've had an audience and an ear for many years, but I really do feel now that there is an audience that is willing to listen. It's not the choir that I'm used to, because you'd go to sustainable fashion events around the world. And it would be, like you said, primarily women. I'd say 95% of my classes at FIT. And this is not to dismiss the men who are doing great work. There are, but it is a substantially, large group of women who are doing this work in my classes, at the conferences that I would attend, and so yeah, I think I'm just still finding it.
And that's totally
Yeah,
okay.
it is.
And
I think
that's, you know what?
it's always
Everything
there.
is a journey. It's not necessarily that destination. And I think I'm still finding my voice. I mean, I do this all the time and I do this for a living.
Mhm.
And, I'm able to create spaces for conversation. But I'm also still finding my voice, and there are times where I feel great about what I've said, and then there are times where I just don't feel the greatest about what I said, or
Right,
I could have done it better, or I could have done it differently.
right.
And so I love the fact that you brought this up because I think we're all on a journey to find our voice. And I think that there's maybe a moment where you can reflect back on and say, yes, that was a day that I really felt that I
Yeah,
had my voice. But then you can also reflect and be like, oh, that was a day where I didn't really have my voice. So,
yeah,
I
yeah.
love that you said that. One question that I do have for you: what does the future hold for you? What is something that excites you and that you're looking forward to in your future of your journey?
Uh, I think more transparency work with Another Tomorrow, specifically figuring out how we can connect the dots in our supply chain and make it more inclusive, more climate neutral, or even climate beneficial. That's really what we're working towards. Have the ear and the eye of the farmers that we're working with and the artisans, to really highlight and amplify their craft and their work. Um, and really see how my my vision, and I sometimes, when I close my eyes and try to vision it, is really that there is a lack of dots being connected. And there is an industry of great people, stakeholders, individuals, companies doing really good work, but I don't see how they're connected to one another because they're operating sometimes very heads down, justly so,
Right.
because they're doing research, or they're doing development, or they're prototyping, or they're in a lab, and so they don't have
Right.
the ability to really reach out and connect to the people. And that's the role I've always seen myself play in the industry, is this connector. I love introducing people, starting conversations, putting them in a room, even if it's a virtual room, to meet and greet and see where they overlap, if at all. And sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've plunked two people together when they have nothing to talk about, but very, very frequently there is a great conversation to be had. I used to visualize some kind of tool that could work to connect all these dots. I just don't think I'm going to be the one to develop it. Maybe somebody else will. In the meantime, I'm just going to send the introductory emails and drag people to parties and events, when those start happening again, and make sure that they are in the same room together to talk, because that's, it's beyond collaboration. It's knowing who's doing what
Innovation.
and avoiding an overlap.
Yeah.
Uh, Avoiding inefficiencies and overlap, and working together to really solve problems.
And creating innovation through conversation.
Yeah.
We need way more people like that. I do it too. I'm a big connector and I love connecting people. And we definitely need people to do that. Like you said, it's bigger than collaboration. It goes into that innovation, and we're not going to create that innovation if we don't have those conversations and just sort of field those conversations and see where we go with them. So finally, my I can't believe that we're coming to the end of this because I think you and I could talk for hours.
It seems that way.
But what advice do you have for, women that, or even men, or even future supply chain leaders to follow in your footsteps? What advice do you have?
Yeah, so I mean, the one piece of advice is not to be shy to ask questions. So all of the interns that I've worked with, and junior staff, and um, anyone who's working in sustainability primarily, and I'll talk about just sustainability in the fashion space because I'm not as familiar. It's been so long since I worked in conventional fashion, even though I touch on it with some clients. Is everyone is very, very open to sharing information, ideas, having a conversation, and you can only get there by asking questions and being vulnerable. Ultimately, is what it is admitting when you don't know what you don't know, and asking for
Mhm.
help. And I think that has been a lesson that I've probably learned the hard way. I never was very well suited to asking for help, and I'm still learning. But I think that that's something that is really important to be able to learn. So that's
Yeah.
the advice that I can give.
I love it. Well, those are incredible words that I think we can all take on board. I really enjoyed that. Fashion is at a crucial point right now, and we can't continue to ignore the negative impact of fast, disposable fashion on the environment and community. And so it's inspiring to hear about the innovations happening and the people like Tara who are instrumental in driving that change. It's an exciting time to be part of this fashion revolution because what Tara and her peers are doing now is truly shaping the fashion of the future and also the supply chains of the future. So, thank you so much to the absolutely amazing Tara for joining me today on Women in Supply Chain.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been wonderful speaking with you.